I have driven plenty of pickup trucks in my day. Some I've owned, others I've borrowed from friends, and a bunch more I've reviewed. But never in my life have I ever experienced anything quite like this Ford Ranger. I don't think my trouble with this truck has anything to do with its age, but don't forget, it's not exactly new. Sure, it's new to North America, but you've been able to buy this thing in other parts of the world for almost a decade now. It was updated in 2015, and then it was tweaked just a little bit before it came to the market here last year, but other than that, it's still a pretty old truck. Yet it manages to feel a lot more modern inside and out than the Chevy Colorado, which was introduced in about 2015. The other thing I like about this truck is that you can get it with all kinds of advanced safety features that you can't get in the Colorado. There's stuff like lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring, and automatic emergency braking, and all of it is standard in the Lariat I'm driving as well as the XLT, but you can even add it to the base truck. And it all works really well, especially this lane keep system. It just kind of gently nudges you away from the lane markings you're drifting towards instead of ping-ponging you from one set of lane markings to the next, and I like the subtlety of it all. The other thing is this one's got adaptive cruise control, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is the only midsize truck you can buy in Canada that's offered with adaptive cruise. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments section below. But if you look at it like something like the Colorado that I drove not too long ago, and you watched that review already, right? And subscribed? But if you look at that truck compared to this one, it just doesn't have the features that you can get in the Ranger, and that alone is enough to move it up my shopping list. Something else I really like in terms of advanced safety is that the blind spot monitoring system isn't just watching what's going around the truck, but it works if you're pulling a trailer too, which is huge. I love that extra peace of mind you get with a system that has your back if you're pulling something behind you, because you know as well as I do that sometimes you don't always notice what's happening if you've got a big trailer back there. Now, granted, I am driving the fully loaded version of this Ranger, but it just looks and feels way nicer in here than that Colorado I drove a couple weeks ago. And yeah, this leather probably plays a factor in that, but it goes beyond that. And maybe it has to do with the layout of these controls and stuff, but I'd argue that this is probably the nicest cabin on the mid-size market right now. And the other thing about this space is that it's actually really roomy. I'm not exactly a small guy, but I don't feel cramped in here at all. When you look at headroom, I've got tons of it, and if you look at something like the Toyota Tacoma, that is a big issue. And then the same thing goes with shoulder room. When I was in that Colorado, I felt really cramped, especially with someone in the passenger seat beside me. But in here, I've got more than enough room, and it reminds me of my old F-150. The argument's mostly the same about the back seat too. Yeah, it is a little bit more cramped than a full-size truck, but if you look at it compared to that Colorado, it is way roomier. In that truck, I had a pretty hard time getting back there, and yeah, I am about 6'3", but in this one I have more than enough room, which is a nice bonus because it has such a small footprint, yet there's no real compromise to passenger space. Now, in terms of some of the tech you interact with in here, there's an 8-inch touchscreen on the dash that runs Ford's Sync 3, which has a built-in Wi-Fi hotspot as well as Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Truth be told, it could be just this one I'm driving, but this touchscreen has been pretty laggy this week. And the other thing is Apple CarPlay has refused to connect a couple times, which is a pretty rare occurrence these days. Again, it just might need a software update, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on if you take one for a test drive. Bring your USB cord, plug it in, and make sure it works the way it's supposed to before you buy, because it can be pretty irritating. There are also a couple 4-inch LCD screens in this gauge cluster that give you the usual information: nav, audio, fuel economy, and so on. Now, since I have the FX4 package, I've also got some off-road info like the terrain management mode I have it set in, as well as some pitch and roll gauges, which is pretty cool, but I would gladly swap either one of these screens for a conventional analog tachometer. I mean, this is a truck after all, and I would love to be able to glance down, see that tach, and know exactly what's going on with this engine. Because the thing is, there are a couple digital ones you can pull up, but they are a little bit on the small side, and I shouldn't have to strain my eyes to see that info, especially if I'm out on a trail or I have a trailer behind me. This is a bit of a problem, but for the most part, it is nice to have that information at the ready. Okay, so here's the scoop on this powertrain. It's pretty simple. There's only one way you can buy a Ranger in Canada, and that's as a 4x4 with a 10-speed automatic transmission and a turbocharged 4-cylinder under the hood. I do wish you could get a V6 in there for towing purposes, but for the most part, this thing is fine for everyday driving. It makes 270 horsepower to go along with 310 pound-feet of torque, both of which are plenty. The other thing is I've been doing a little bit better than it's rated for in terms of fuel economy this week, and I've got it down to about 10.5 liters per 100 kilometers, which is about 1.5 liters per 100 better than I was doing in that Colorado. And in that one, I spent way more time on the highway. Granted, it had Meteor tires, and this one has pretty basic road tires, but it's still noteworthy. And yes, that was a V6 and this is a 4-cylinder, but it's just something worth pointing out. My only issue with this powertrain is a well-documented one, and its gear changes from this 10-speed automatic. They're just really clunky sometimes, and whether you're talking upshifts or downshifts, low in the count, they're really jarring, and the same goes for when you put it in reverse sometimes. But for the most part, it is really well sorted. Now, this is the same 2.3 liter you can get in the Ford Mustang, but it is a little bit different. So the compression ratio is a bit higher and output is down. But it's pretty good for the most part, and it delivers really smooth torque, but it's different than most turbocharged 4-cylinders. Instead of that really broad torque plateau, it kind of climbs gradually until peak at 3,000 RPM, and then it drops off from there. But again, it is really usable, and that's all that matters in a pickup truck, especially if you're trying to haul something out of a rut or get yourself out of a jam on a trail. It's nice to know that you can bury your foot into it and it's gonna respond. I think the only time you're ever going to notice any real issues with throttle response is when you're passing or merging on the highway, but again, that has to do more with the transmission than the engine itself, because it can just feel a little hesitant to drop down a gear before it realizes what you want to do. And it can be a little problematic when you're caught so flat-footed, especially if you're in a lane that's ending and you're trying to get in front of a truck before it's too late. It can be a little bit frustrating. Now, again, you can drop it down into sport mode, but I hate having to think about that stuff because we're talking about a fairly modern transmission, and it should be able to handle that stuff on its own. Something I really like about this truck is this steering setup. Nice and relaxed, easy to maneuver at low speeds, which helps when you're lining up with a trailer or out on the trail. But once you hit cruising speed, it firms up just enough to give you a little bit of weight without feeling too heavy. If you look at the Colorado, it's a lot more car-like, which is nice, but I think more people are gonna like this steering setup versus something like that, or something like the Jeep Gladiator that is very floaty. Okay, so here's what I'm stuck on with this truck. It's the suspension. The way it's tuned is just so bizarre. Let's say you're cruising along and you hit a rough patch. It's almost like the damping gets overwhelmed and it can't control the movement. And I'm not just talking about the typical truck stiffness. There's some of that too, but it's like rigidity in the suspension components. It's very, very bizarre. But then if you're cruising along and you roll over something or you shift your hips in your seats, it springs around like a jack-in-the-box. It's just so different and I can't get used to it. I'm not saying it's disconcerting, but it's definitely different. If you look at the Gladiator, the Tacoma, or the Colorado, they're all pretty firm and well put together. But this is one of the most softly sprung vehicles I've ever driven, and it reminds me of my buddy's old Jeep TJ that he lifted with Ford Crown Victoria springs. I just can't get used to it. Now, like I said, this truck has the FX4 package. No, it's not quite as off-road ready as the Chevy Colorado ZR2, but there's a bunch of stuff on here that makes it more capable out on the trail. You've got specially tuned shocks, a locking rear differential, as well as a whole bunch of skid plates underneath and some electronic trickery that you can control from inside the cabin. So let's go have some fun. Do I actually expect many of you to do anything like this in your Ranger? Absolutely not, but some of you might, and besides, it is so much fun out here. I absolutely love wheeling. Now, this is the same trail I had that Wrangler Rubicon out on not too long ago, but it's changed quite a bit after a whole bunch of rain. And I do have to be a bit more strategic in this thing, but it's handling itself pretty well. I have the 4x4 system set to 4-wheel high, but I don't have the rear axle locked. And I do have the terrain management system set to mud and ruts, but honestly, it's pretty much a cakewalk out here, and it's not having any more trouble than that Wrangler did. Now, I will point out a couple of things that I am concerned about. One, these tires aren't really trail-rated tires, and I do wish that they were geared just a little bit more towards the off-road. They're great out on the street, but out here they are slipping and spinning, and they're getting pretty caked with mud. The other thing is, I don't like how low these side steps hang. They just make me a little bit nervous. And the same goes for the mounting points for the shocks on the rear axle. The knuckles just sit so low that you can even hear them dragging off of the ruts here. I couldn't imagine being out on more rock and just hearing those things slam off the stone. But for the most part, it's handling itself really well, and I am very impressed with just how composed it is out here. And this might be the only place where that springy suspension comes in handy, because the truck just articulates so well, and it helps you avoid some of the bigger obstacles without too much trouble. Considering the FX4 package is only a $1,400 upgrade, to me it's a no-brainer. Sure, there's the extra weight of all the skid plates and stuff, but they don't affect the way this thing drives on the road. And to me, it's worth the price of admission for that locking rear differential alone. So let's say you want a loaded crew cab model like this one. You're gonna pay about 43 grand before freight and taxes, but don't forget there's probably a whole whack of incentives waiting for you at the dealership. But if you want this exact truck, we're talking FX4, blackout package, 10-speaker stereo, adaptive cruise control, you're looking at about 10 grand more. Yeah, 53,000 bucks before tax is a lot of money, but don't forget about those incentives. And if you can get this thing down below 50 grand, I think you're looking at a pretty good deal. To recap, I like the advanced safety features you can get in the Ranger, as well as the spot-on steering and the affordable FX4 package. I don't like the clunky transmission, the laggy touchscreen, or the springy suspension. I was really looking forward to driving this new Ranger, and I'm not totally put off by it, but I'm still not sold on this suspension after almost a week behind the wheel. I like so much else about this truck, but it might be just a bit too springy for my taste. On the flip side, the cabin is great, it is very capable off-road, and it's hard to argue with those advanced driver assist features you can get. My best advice to you is to drive it against something like the Colorado or Tacoma and see what you like best. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe!